Ben, good to see you again. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, good to see you, Ian. It's been a while.
You and I have met in the White House, and for an administration that made its name on wanting to build hope. And I wonder, after your time in the Obama administration, how do you get to a point where you say that the world increasingly can't look to the United States as an example? What has changed in your mind?
Well, I think there were two stages to this, Ian. I think the first stage was, coming fully to grips with the kind of radicalization in the Republican Party in the United States. The real danger that posed to our democracy, and then the damage that did to our standing in the world. And like you, I travel constantly. And what I found in the months after Trump's election was it wasn't so much the fact that Donald Trump was president that concerned people around the world. It was the fact that we elected Donald Trump president and we could do that again, and that maybe we weren't the kind of, countries disagree with our foreign policy, but they could at least look to us as a stable democratic example. And then I think in the process of writing this book, I just wanted to kind of interrogate some of my assumptions as someone who worked in a high-ranking foreign policy position. Yes, America's done extraordinarily good things around the world, but the ways in which our era of American hegemony has also contributed to some of the negative trends we see around the world. Now, I still think that what America is supposed to be is something that is incredibly hopeful.
Where were you on your travels? And yeah, you and I go all over the place, and you went to some pretty interesting spots in terms of democracy and its failings. What surprised you the most?
Hungary and Hong Kong are two places that stood out to me that I spent a lot of time on the book. And in Hungary, what was so interesting to me was to talk to Hungarian democratic activists and to have them essentially explain how in a decade Viktor Orban turned what was a democracy into something more like a single-party autocracy. And the playbook that he used was quite similar to the one in the United States, get elected on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis, redraw the parliamentary districts to favor your party, change the voting laws to make it easier for your supporters to vote, wrap it all up in an us versus them nationalist message, us, the true Hungarians, versus them, the immigrants, the Muslims, George Soros, a pretty eerily similar playbook. But I think part of what surprised me was how much, when I talked to these young people and I asked them kind of to walk me through the experience of their lifetime after the fall of the Berlin Wall, how unsettled democracy always was, the extent to which these questions that I think Americans thought had been settled, at least settled in the democratic world, were really not resolved in places like Eastern Europe.
Hungary is, of course, a member of the European Union, still in good standing, even though lots of people are very antagonized by them. Do you think democracy in Hungary is lost?
I don't. One of the things that I found, and I kind of profile some of the opposition figures who started political parties, who've gotten real traction, making the same argument that another character in my book, Alexei Navalny, is making in Russia, basically an anti-corruption argument, that autocracy fuels corruption, that Orban is stealing from the people. And I'm very disappointed that the European Union hasn't taken a firmer stance with Orban himself. He still benefits from all this EU funding that he just siphons off the top to enrich his cronies who then finance his politics or buy up the media. I think that the US, the European Union, has taken this for granted for too long, that democracy was a settled question.
Hong Kong obviously is another place where this has become an existential issue and where I would argue they've lost, right? The Democrats are done for. There's no going back. First of all, do you agree with that?
Yeah, the tragedy is, having spent time with a bunch of them, most of the people I talked to for my book are no longer in Hong Kong, which tells you everything you need to know, When I really reflected on the last 30 years, because, I deal with this question, how did we go from Tiananmen Square when it looked like that was the losing end of the direction of global events to today, where Hong Kong looks like the future. And I think that's very important, is that Hong Kong should be seen as a warning of where this can go. I realized, Ian, there's an uncomfortable truth that at no point in this 30-year period did the American government, American businesses, American entertainment, democracy was never the priority in the Chinese relationship. In the Obama years, in the first term, it was recovering from the global financial crisis, an important thing. In the second term, it was getting to a Paris Agreement, an important thing. I know why we prioritize those things. But then under Bush, it was, security issues and the war on terrorism. Under Clinton, it was opening up markets, lowering prices, bringing them into the WTO. At every stage of the last 30 years, a commercial interest or security interest or geopolitical interest was always above what our interests were on an issue like Hong Kong. And so I don't know that anything could have been done, in the last year or two to forestall the outcome in Hong Kong. But I do think we have to reckon with the reality that for all of our words about democracy over the years, can we really say that we've ever really gone to the mat on human rights and democratic issues with the Chinese Communist Party? We have not prioritized democracy itself at home and in our foreign policy over the course of the last 30 years in the same way that for all the problems with the Cold War, right? I mean, we didn't get everything right there, but there was this kind of paradigm where democracy itself was at the top of a hierarchy of a set of interests because we needed to draw the contrast with the Soviet Union.
I mean, if you're the United States and Saudi Arabia is a core ally and we're focused on national security and alliances around the world, and we're concerned about terrorism and the private sector is very important, everyone that looks at the US would say that human rights has played a role, certainly, but no one would say that human rights has played the priority role. How do you change that? And how much of a priority do you honestly think it could and should be?
Look, I've been in government. I recognize the challenges. I recognize that there are trade-offs and all the rest of it. That said, I think we've just gone way too far in the other direction. So I think it is time to say, if we truly believe, and you hear this from the administration, that democracy versus autocracy is kind of the existential question of this time. If you believe that, you cannot have the relationship that we have with the Saudi Arabia or Egypt, period. It's difficult, sure. But at some point, you have to show that you will make the difficult choice for democracy itself. And I also think with China, for instance, what's interesting is there's so much overwhelming momentum towards wanting to get a piece of that Chinese market that we have all kind of collectively self-censored. The US government has been pretty cautious in how it talks about human rights issues in China until quite recently with the excesses of the situation with the Uyghurs in Hong Kong. US businesses, I think have to be candid that they've kind of checked their values at the door.
No, I guess it was you and Samantha Power that were talking about the fact that on a much smaller issue, on the Armenia genocide recognition, where President Obama, when he was running, said he was going to make that recognition, then decided against it because of Turkey, which, it's not China. It's nothing close to China. And you said that was a mistake. And Biden actually went ahead and then did do that. Turned out there wasn't much blowback as a consequence.
Yeah, it was a mistake. And I think that, there's a couple elements to this, Ian. The first is that we are often cautious because of those extra responsibilities you talk about. When you're the big superpower, you feel like you don't want to rock the boat too much in other areas. But the reality is, China is not shy on commenting on issues in America. Russians are not shy, not just about commenting, but actually really engage. The interference that they claim that we do in their politics it's projection. They're doing much, much worse and much more aggressive in our politics. Why can't we say what we think about the Armenian genocide? Why can't we say what we think about the situation in Tibet or in Xinjiang province or in Hong Kong? Some of this is just, there's been this kind of self-imposed restraint that I, frankly felt tension with when I was in government and had a communications function. And I think we, in some ways, as we're entering a period when America is really no longer a hegemon, that should be kind of liberating in a way, that we're this country that can exercise its voice much more, I think, aggressively and stand for a set of values much more consistently. At least I think that's what we need to do, because the reality is, American exceptionalism is the story we tell about America. We obviously don't always live up to it. And now the rest of the world has seen, well, we can have a corrupt autocrat with a son-in-law down the hall, just like anybody else. We can have a mob storm the parliament just like anybody else. The opportunity in that is if we can fight through that and we can preserve a multiracial democracy, we're setting an example that is more recognizable to the world. It's not lectures on democracy from on high. It's like, hey, we're doing the work here at home. We're just going to talk about these things around the world. I think that has the potential to ripple out and create a pendulum swing in the other direction more than kind of issuing dictates from Washington about democratic values on a written statement.
So we've talked a lot about foreign policy, and of course that was your principal role in the Obama administration, but the book is also about the fact that democracy inside the United States is not moving where it needs to be, that it is hard for us to lead by example because we don't believe in our democracy the way we should, the way we perhaps used to. What are some things that you think are actually plausible that would help to address, that would move the needle on that fundamental issue for American democracy?
Part of what's different is technology. Part of what's different is the way in which social media and technology has literally made it possible for a very large chunk of this country to live in an alternative reality. And I remember in the Obama years, you could look at polls that showed that huge majorities of Republicans believed that Obama was not born in America and think, oh, those people are just nuts. Well, no, those people they believe that. And today, the scale of the number of Americans who believe things that are not true and in many cases are totally insane.
Believe that the vaccine will hurt you. Believe that Trump won the 2020 election. I mean, the United States today has a greater divide between Democrats and Republicans and who is not being vaccinated than in any major democracy in the world today among political parties. That is exactly the issue you were pointing to.
That's right. And so you can't fix anything with this many people living in an alternative reality. So I think that the Biden team needs to start thinking very, very constructively and very seriously about how to work with the tech industry to regulate social media platforms so that they are not turbocharging disinformation and conspiracy theory in ways that are literally warping our nation. This has to be, you hear a lot about voting rights, and that is absolutely essential. And if that effort can't pass because of the filibuster, people have to get down in the state and local areas and mobilize people to register and try to push back against laws. And yes, we have to be protecting the right to vote. We have to be taking on the corrosive amounts of money in politics and the lack of transparency, all those sets of issues. But this other issue, to me, may even be more important because you can do all the things you want. If 40% of this country will believe anything that is being mainlined into their social media feeds and turbocharged by everything from Russian disinformation to top-down financing from mega donors, there's going to be a limit on how much we can fix our democracy. So I do think this issue of tech regulation of social media platforms is one that you hear a lot more about from the right than the left. That's because they know that it's working for them and they don't want it to change because they know that Facebook has become a perfect tool for them to keep their people in this alternative reality. So that's something I think we need to hear more about from the administration, and I hope we will.
If you had to point to the single biggest thing that the Obama administration could have done differently in retrospect, knowing what we know now, what would it have been?
When I look back, and I think the Biden people have internalized this lesson to some extent. We only had those first 2 years to make real structural change because we lost the House of Representatives after that. And I think clearly there were missed opportunities in terms of the efforts that were made to save the American and global economy, preserved and in many ways exacerbated the very inequality that was the characteristic of the financial crisis. Because when you're just pumping enormous amounts of money, not just from our stimulus or not just from the TARP program, but from quantitative easing, just so much money being pumped into the institutions that create the structures that perpetuate inequality, we should have been doing more upfront to try to narrow inequality when we had those congressional majorities.
Given where we're heading, how much do you worry that the 2024 election process is not just a repeat of 2020, but actually becomes more delegitimized, that the population becomes more broken on the back of it?
I'm incredibly worried because two big lessons that I take away from writing this book. One, anything can happen here. And two, look at what the Republicans are doing. They tend to be pretty upfront about what they're doing. And so when they're passing laws in states like Texas, like Georgia, where the laws have the intent of allowing elected Republican officials to overturn the results of the election, they're doing that because that is something that they want to do. They're not just doing that, to fill time. And so the fact that there's even any possibility that we could have an election in 2024 that not only suffers from grave voter suppression, but literally you could have people overturning the democratic will of the people, that should be terrifying and mobilizing force for people. I think what I'm hopeful about is, again, is we can fight through that and overcome that in the same way that we did in 2020. I think each one of these elections, we're getting closer to getting to the end of the tunnel here. But this is not something that's going to be addressed in just 2 or 4 years. But we along the way have to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to have the bottom pulled out from under us. And right now, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that's exactly what the Republican Party is trying to do.
Ben Rhodes, the book is After the Fall. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Ian.